She looked as though life had wrung every last drop out of her. A faded nurse's uniform frayed at the collar, shoes worn thin from long nights that never seemed to end. Beneath her eyes lay the shadows of a woman accustomed to staying awake to hold on to other people's lives, only to return home where no one held on to the life quietly draining out of her own. In that opulent room, where the scent of costly leather mingled with fine perfume, they looked at her the way one looks at a stray scratch marring a flawless painting. Some smirked. Others did not bother to lower their voices as they let their cruel remarks fall. She lowered her head, silent as one long used to enduring the contempt of people who had never once had to choose between medicine for a mother and a meal for a child. Then the glass doors shattered, sharp bursts of gunfire tore through the gentle music. The people draped in the most expensive labels suddenly forgot all their refinement. They screamed, they shoved, they trampled one another to crawl beneath the tables, abandoning a man who had collapsed onto the cold floor, blood slowly spreading across the marble. And only one person did not run. The woman they had all just been mocking crossed that room of chaos, knelt beside the stranger, and shielded him with her own fragile body. Her hands, trembling from exhaustion, grew suddenly steady as tempered steel. For they had scorned her, believing she held nothing at all. They never knew she carried the one thing no one in that gilded room possessed: the power to keep a human being on the edge of life. And the man fading beneath her hands, the most ruthless man this city had ever learned to fear, was about to discover something he had never known in all his years. That for the first time, someone was willing to protect him without asking for a single thing in return. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with those you hold dear, and subscribe to our channel to receive more healing stories that linger long in the soul. A few hours before the housing room shattered in gunfire, the city of Denver was still buried beneath the gray mist of dawn. Ruth Delaney stepped out through the doors of the public hospital before the streetlights had even had time to go dark, carrying the weight of 2 back-to-back shifts on her shoulders. Her legs felt as heavy as if they'd been bound in lead, yet her steps remained steady, with the steadiness of someone who had learned that if she allowed herself to stop for even a single moment, she might no longer have the strength to stand up again. She pulled up the collar of her thin coat, the same coat that had carried her through 3 winters, and turned toward the elegant medical building downtown, where there was a coffee shop she'd never imagined she would set foot in, if not for an appointment she couldn't avoid. In her coat pocket, her old phone gave a faint vibration. The screen, cracked by a diagonal line, showed a calendar reminder she had read so many times she knew it by heart: her mother's next dialysis session on Thursday morning, along with the cost that made her heart tighten every time she saw it. Just beneath it was another message, sent from the landline at home, typed by tiny fingers that her grandmother had patiently guided. "I love you, Mommy. Remember to eat breakfast." Ruth stopped in the middle of the empty sidewalk and read those words twice, then 3 times, and something warm and painful rose in her chest. The little girl was only 5 years old, and yet she already knew how to worry about her mother more than all the grown people who had once walked through Ruth's life and left. She typed back a short line: "I love you more than anything in the world. I'll be home early tonight," then slipped the phone back into her pocket as though she were putting away the only remaining piece of light she still had. The door of the coffee shop opened before her, as if it were opening into another world. The air inside was thick with warmth, fragrant with roasted coffee beans, and some expensive scent she couldn't name. Soft leather chairs, gleaming stone tabletops, and people sitting there in such polished composure that it seemed they had never known the meaning of exhaustion. Ruth quietly chose a small table near a hidden corner, trying to make herself smaller so no one would have to notice her faded nurse's uniform. She had come here to meet someone from the hospital debt recovery office, an appointment she had postponed 3 times because she hadn't been brave enough to ask them for more time, to beg them not to transfer her late husband's debt to a collection agency. She placed a stack of carefully smoothed papers on the table, the bills, the requests for deferred payment that she had stayed awake all night filling out. Her hands, the same hands that were used to holding a stethoscope and clinging tightly to the lives of so many strangers, now trembled faintly before a single sheet of paper. She ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu, the only thing she allowed herself, not because she was thirsty, but because she knew she had no right to sit in a place like this without buying anything. The server glanced at her once and then turned away, and Ruth lowered her head over the papers, trying not to let anyone see that her eyes were stinging. She looked around that unfamiliar room, among the soft laughter and the delicate clink of china cups touching one another, and she felt lost to the very depths of herself. But she had grown used to that feeling. For 2 years now, ever since the day she lost the man who had once promised to walk with her through the rest of her life, Ruth had learned to carry everything alone, to stand by herself against every storm, to swallow her tears, so that when morning came, she would still have enough tenderness for her daughter, and enough patience for the mother who was growing weaker day by day. She didn't know that in only a few more hours, this very cold and unfamiliar room would become the place where her fate turned toward a direction she had never dared imagine, and those hands, trembling from exhaustion, would be tested in a way no shift had ever prepared her for. Ruth was still bent over the stack of papers when she felt the change in the air before she even lifted her head. It was a strange sensation, as if the temperature in the room had just dropped by a few degrees, as if all the cheerful noise from moments earlier had suddenly softened by one beat. The door of the coffee shop opened and a man stepped inside with 2 others following close behind him. But he was the one who made the whole room shift. He wasn't large in any showy way, and he didn't need to raise his voice. Yet every step he placed on the stone floor carried a weight that forced people to notice. Damon Crane had neatly combed black hair, an angular face that revealed not the slightest emotion, and eyes as cold as a lake frozen over in the heart of winter, the kind of gaze belonging to a man far too accustomed to watching others lower their heads. The manager of the cafe hurried out, his back bending slightly in an unconscious bow, his voice suddenly growing so soft and respectful that Ruth found it strange. "Sir, the table in the private corner has been prepared as you requested, and everything is exactly as you ordered." Damon only gave a faint nod, without a word of thanks, without a smile, because to him, that obedience wasn't something that required a response. It was simply the natural order of the world. He chose to sit at a table in the middle of the cafe, among the crowd and the light, not because he was careless but because he had calculated it, because he wanted the man across from him to understand that this meeting was taking place openly, on neutral ground, where Damon was confident to the point of arrogance that no one alive would dare touch him in broad daylight. The man already waiting at that table, a middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit, sprang to his feet when he saw Damon arrive, and the hand he extended was damp with sweat. Damon didn't shake it. He simply pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, then placed his interlaced hands on the tabletop and looked straight into the other man's eyes, with a stare that made him swallow hard. The conversation unfolded in low voices, almost whispers, but every word Damon spoke was as sharp as a finely honed blade. He reminded the man of a promise that had not been kept, of a sum of money that should already have been exactly where it belonged, and he said all of it without raising his voice, without making any obvious threat, because he knew the calmness of a man who held real power was more frightening than any shout. "I gave you 1 chance already," Damon said, and he said it as gently as if they were discussing the weather. "A wise man understands that a second chance is something I rarely give, and a third chance has never existed in my dictionary." The man's face went pale. He stammered a few promises, and Damon only watched him tremble in silence, the way one might watch a small animal that had realized it had fallen into a trap. And yet, even within that cold brutality, there was still a line Damon had never crossed, an unspoken rule that everyone in this underworld knew well, that he could crush anyone who dared betray or deceive him. But he never touched the innocent, the vulnerable people standing outside the game, the ordinary human beings who were only trying to survive one day at a time. When the man accidentally mentioned an opponent's family as a bargaining chip, Damon's eyes suddenly darkened, and he cut him off with a single sentence that silenced the entire table. "We don't touch anyone's wife or children. If you mention that again, you and I will have nothing left to discuss." Only a few tables away, Ruth happened to lift her eyes and caught that moment, and though she couldn't hear every word clearly, she still felt the cold power radiating from that unfamiliar man, a power that sent a shiver through her and made her quickly lower her head, without the faintest idea that in only a short while, her own hands would be the only thing keeping that powerful man anchored to this world. At the table beside Ruth, A young couple had just settled in with the posture of people who believed the entire world had been born to serve them. The man, Trevor Ashford, wore a glossy tailored suit, his hair carefully gelled into place down to the last strand, while the woman sitting next to him, Sienna Vale, glittered beneath expensive jewelry and carried a handbag worth half a year of Ruth's wages. Sienna's eyes slid over Ruth's faded nurse's uniform, paused at the collar with its frayed threads and the shoes worn thin from use. Then she tilted her head close to Trevor's ear, deliberately, speaking just loudly enough for the person beside her to hear. "Look at that. Some people truly don't know where they belong. This isn't the kind of place where someone should drag in all their limp exhaustion and put it on display." Trevor gave a soft laugh, turning the glass of water in his hand, then spoke in a lazy voice filled with the air of someone granting charity. "Come on, sweetheart. Maybe she got lost. She probably thought this was the hospital cafeteria. When people make a living cleaning up after others, how could they possibly tell the difference between somewhere elegant and somewhere ordinary?" Sienna giggled, lifting a hand to cover her mouth with practiced delicacy, her eyes still fixed on Ruth as though she were some cheap little amusement, laid out for their entertainment while they waited for coffee. "I just don't understand why management lets people like that in here. They make the whole atmosphere feel heavy. Just sitting near them is annoying. It's almost as if the smell of desperation might rub off on you." Every word fell like a small needle, sharp and cold, sinking into the most vulnerable place inside the woman who sat with her head lowered. Ruth heard it all. She heard every word clearly, every scoffing laugh, every insult wrapped in false politeness. Her hand tightened a little around the stack of papers, and for one moment, an entire sea of things she wanted to say rose into her throat. She wanted to tell them that the hands they were mocking had once pressed down on the chest of a child who had stopped breathing until that child came back to life, that this faded uniform had absorbed so much sweat and so many tears through the nights she had stayed beside the beds of strangers while her own daughter slept at home. But she said nothing. She only closed her eyes softly, drew in a deep breath, and let the storm inside her settle, because she had learned long ago that a person's dignity didn't lie in how they answered cruelty, but in whether they allowed that cruelty to turn them into someone like the people who despised them. She lifted her head, straightened her back, and continued arranging her papers with a calmness that made even Sienna and Trevor feel a small flash of disappointment, because they hadn't managed to draw any reaction from her. What those two arrogant people failed to realize was that another pair of eyes in the room had quietly followed the entire scene. From the table in the center of the cafe, Damon Crane had stopped paying attention to the trembling man across from him. His cold gaze was now resting on the woman in the faded nurse's uniform, and something about her caught his attention in a way very few people ever could. He had spent his whole life studying people, reading their weaknesses and their true nature from the smallest gestures, and what he saw in this woman surprised him, because amid that rain of poisonous words, she didn't show fear, nor did she flare with anger. She simply endured it with a calmness he had only ever seen in people who had passed through losses so vast that every insult became small. And Damon, a man who had never concerned himself with anyone, suddenly found himself wondering who that quiet woman really was. But his thoughts were instantly shattered as the glass doors of the cafe exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Men with heavy weapons stormed inside, spraying a hail of bullets that ripped through the elegant space and tore the peaceful afternoon apart. Screams erupted and panic took over as people scrambled blindly for cover, leaving the center of the room a war zone in the blink of an eye. Before the smoke and the screaming had even had time to fade, Ruth crawled out from beneath the table where she had just taken shelter, and while all the other elegant people were frantically searching for a way to escape, her eyes were pulled toward the man collapsed in the middle of the floor. It was the same powerful man who had walked into the cafe only minutes earlier, with a presence that had made the whole room lower its head, now fallen onto the cold stone floor, one side of his shoulder slowly spreading with a deep crimson stain, his face growing paler with every passing instant. In that split second, a voice rang out in Ruth's mind, clear and cold, telling her this wasn't an ordinary accident, that the men who had just stormed in with weapons in their hands and the reckless nerve to strike in a crowded place were not ordinary robbers, and that the man lying there must be someone she shouldn't get involved with if she still wanted to keep herself safe. She understood that. She understood that stepping closer to him could drag her and her small family into a world she couldn't even imagine. But then the part of her that had been tempered through thousands of night shifts, the instinct that had been driven deep into her flesh and blood, after so many years standing on the line between life and death, that instinct overcame her fear, because to Ruth, a human being bleeding and standing at the edge of death right before her eyes was no longer friend or enemy, no longer a powerful man or a nameless stranger, but simply a life that needed to be saved, and she couldn't turn her back and walk away, any more than she had ever been able to turn her back on anyone. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside him, both knees pressing against the hard stone floor, and her hands immediately found the wound at his shoulder, where blood was spilling out with terrifying speed. She pressed her palm down hard to stop the flow, feeling the warmth of life seeping out beneath her fingers, and in that moment, all the frantic noise around her suddenly receded into the distance, leaving only her, the man fading in front of her, and the fight to win back each breath. Ruth bent close, bringing her ear near his face to listen to the breathing that was growing shallow and rapid, then placed 2 fingers against his neck to search for a pulse, and that pulse was weak, flickering like a candle about to die in the wind. She knew she didn't have much time. She knew that if he continued losing blood at this speed, there would be no chance for any ambulance to arrive in time. With a calmness she herself didn't understand how she had found in the middle of such horror, Ruth began doing what her hands had done 1,000 times in her life. She snatched the thick cloth napkin from the nearest table, folded it tightly, then pressed it straight against the wound, putting the full weight of her body into it to stop the bleeding. The man gave a faint groan, his eyelids trembling open, and in those cold eyes that had once frightened an entire city, something very much like astonishment flickered for the first time, because he couldn't understand why, when everyone else was running away, a stranger who owed him nothing, a woman whom this very room had looked down on only minutes earlier, was kneeling here now, placing her own hands over his wound to keep him anchored to this world. Blood was still soaking through the thick napkin beneath Ruth's palm, and she knew that pressure alone wouldn't be enough. She needed something to bind the wound tightly and free her hands for more urgent things. Her eyes swept quickly over the chaotic floor, and then she suddenly saw the man's leather belt, which had slipped loose when he fell. She reached out and grabbed it, threaded it swiftly over the folded cloth, and cinched it tight around the upper part of his shoulder with firm, decisive force, enough to hold back the flow of blood without cutting off the life in his arm completely. Her hands moved quickly, without a wasted motion, without a second of hesitation, as though all the years she had spent standing in emergency rooms were pouring themselves into this one moment. But as soon as she managed to slow the bleeding, she realized another danger, one even more frightening, was closing in. The man's face was turning visibly ashen, his lips had begun to take on a bluish color, and his whole body shook in waves of cold, signs Ruth knew far too well. His body was falling into shock from blood loss, and if she let him sink into that shock, he would slip away from her, even if the bleeding had stopped. She immediately slid one hand beneath his head and lifted it gently, then pulled off her own coat in a hurry and spread it over his chest to preserve what little warmth remained. She took hold of both his legs and tried to raise them a little higher, to send that precious blood back toward the heart and brain that were starving for every drop. Then she bent close, placed her other hand against his icy cheek, and tapped it lightly to keep him from sinking into unconsciousness. When she spoke, her voice was no longer the voice of the timid woman who had been insulted only minutes before, but the voice of someone accustomed to ordering death itself to step back. "Look at me," she said. "Look into my eyes. Don't close yours. Can you hear me? Breathe with me. Breathe in slowly, then breathe out. Just keep looking at me and breathe with me." Damon's unfocused eyes flickered toward that voice, and he tried to cling to the face of the woman bending over him like a drowning man, clutching the last piece of wood in the open sea. He fought to inhale to the rhythm she gave him, his chest rising and falling with terrible difficulty, and every breath was a battle, but he kept breathing, because her eyes wouldn't allow him to surrender. Ruth kept speaking to him without stopping, in a voice that was both firm and strangely gentle. She told him he had to hold on, that he wasn't allowed to give up, that the ambulance was on its way and he only needed to hold on to his breath a little longer. And while she spoke, she never took her hand away from the wound, occasionally checking the pulse at his neck, her ears straining to catch every small change in his breathing so she could respond in time. There was a moment when his pulse suddenly weakened and his eyes began to go dull, and Ruth's heart clenched tight. But she didn't panic. She only made her voice stronger, called him back, tapped his cheek with greater firmness, and with a wordless force of will, passed some part of her own life into him. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're not going anywhere yet, look at me." And that man, the one who made an entire underworld tremble, the one who had never depended on anyone in his life, was now placing his whole life in the trembling but steady hands of a strange woman whose name he didn't even know. And in the sound of sirens growing closer from the end of the street, Ruth remained kneeling there, holding tightly to him, holding tightly to the fragile life fluttering beneath her palms, and not once did she let go. The sirens finally swept up to the cafe doors, and in the blink of an eye, paramedics in uniform rushed inside with a stretcher and equipment in their hands. But even as they dropped to their knees beside him, Ruth still hadn't let go. She quickly gave them everything they needed to know, in the short, precise language of her profession: the location of the wound, the amount of blood lost, the moment she had begun controlling the bleeding, the signs of shock she had already treated, and only when she was certain that her colleague's hands had fully taken over, that life did she slowly draw back, her own hands still trembling and stained red, her whole body drained as if she had just stepped out of a storm. She sank down onto the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, and it was in that moment, when the chaos had begun to settle and every eye in the cafe slowly returned to reality, that people finally realized something that left the whole room deathly silent. From beneath a table in the far corner, Trevor Ashford and Sienna Vale slowly crawled out, their expensive clothes rumpled, Trevor's carefully gelled hair now flattened into a messy clump, while Sienna was trembling so hard that her perfect makeup had smeared beneath her terrified tears. The very two people who had just spoken the cruelest words about that poor woman, the same two who had laughed and called her a stain that didn't belong in a place of elegance, were now the first ones who had searched for a hiding place when danger struck, the ones who had curled up under a table without ever turning back to see whether anyone needed help. And now they stood there, seeing with their own eyes that the only person in that dazzling room who had dared step out of fear to save a human life, the only one who hadn't run away, was the very woman they had despised, the woman in the faded nurse's uniform they had believed wasn't worthy of being there. Sienna's eyes met Ruth's, and in that instant, all the arrogance on her face collapsed, replaced by a hot shame that rose all the way to her hairline. She quickly lowered her head, not daring straight at the woman she had humiliated only minutes earlier. Trevor opened his mouth as if he meant to say something, perhaps a clumsy apology, perhaps an excuse, but then he closed it tightly again, because before a person who had just done what he himself would never have had the courage to do, every word became hollow and absurd. Ruth said nothing. She only lifted her head and looked at the two of them once, a look that held no hatred and no triumph, only a weary calm. The look of someone who had passed through too many wounds to still care about striking back at the people who had hurt her. She didn't need to say anything at all, because her silence now carried more weight than 1,000 replies. It laid bare the emptiness beneath their polished shell. It made them see themselves with the cruelest clarity. Then she turned away, slowly following the stretcher with her eyes as it was hurried toward the door, where the strange man she just rested back from death was being taken away. And she had no idea that the ashamed, bowed heads of those two arrogant people were only the final echo of an old world, while the new world, with all the storms and mercy it carried, had only just begun to arrive at the threshold of her life. Damon Crane woke in a room filled with soft light and the familiar smell of antiseptic. But this was no public hospital. It was a private treatment wing, under careful guard, where his most trusted people had brought him as soon as they could, far from curious eyes, and from the dangers still waiting outside. His shoulder was tightly bandaged, and a dull ache rose through him with every breath. But the first thing that flooded back into his mind when he opened his eyes wasn't the pain, nor was it anger that someone had dared raise a hand against him. It was the image of a woman's face, bending close over him in the middle of chaos, a voice ringing beside his ear telling him to look into her eyes and breathe with her, a pair of hands, trembling but steady, that had held him back from the edge. He lay still for a long time, staring up at the white ceiling, trying to name the strange feeling surging in his chest, a feeling he had never tasted in all his powerful and lonely life. All his life, Damon had been used to the idea that everything in this world could be bought with money or fear. He had grown used to people coming near him because they wanted something: protection, money, power, or simply the chance to keep their own lives. And he had grown so used to it that he had come to believe every human connection was only a bargain carefully disguised. But that woman was different. She didn't know who he was. She had no idea how wealthy or powerful he might be, and most important of all, she demanded nothing from him. She had risked her own safety to save a stranger she could easily have turned away from, just as everyone else in that room had done. And that was what unsettled Damon, because for the first time in his life, he carried a debt he couldn't repay with money, a heavy debt of grace and human kindness that no check in the world could ever balance. For a man who always needed to control everything, the feeling of owing someone and being unable to pay was almost unbearable. It made him restless. It gave him no peace. When the door opened and his trusted guard stepped inside to report on the situation, Damon cut him off at once with a single question. "The woman at the coffee shop this morning, the one in the nurse's uniform who saved me, I want to know everything about her." His voice was still low and cold as usual, but the longtime guard immediately recognized something unusual in his employer's eyes, a kind of interest he had never seen Damon show anyone before. Damon ordered him to find out everything: her name, where she lived, her family situation, what burdens she was carrying, every corner of the life of the woman who had saved him, and he wanted all of that information as soon as possible. To him, this was partly the instinct of a man who had spent his life in the shadows, a man who always had to know every person connected to him, no matter how slightly. But this time, deep beneath that cold instinct, there was something else as well. Something he himself still didn't dare admit, a longing to know, to understand the person who had stepped into his life in a way no one ever had before. And when the guard bowed his head slightly and withdrew to carry out the order, Damon closed his eyes again, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, that gentle voice still echoed, "Look at me, breathe with me," like a whisper that refused to let him go. Only 2 days later, the file was placed on the table beside Damon's sickbed, and he turned through each page in silence, reading about the life of the woman who had saved him, as though he were reading a story that made his long, hardened heart tighten in some strange and unexplainable way the deeper he went. Her name was Ruth Delaney. 28 years old, a night shift nurse at a public hospital that was lacking in almost everything, and behind that ordinary name lay a chain of losses he hadn't expected. He read that 2 years earlier, her husband, a gentle worker named Daniel, had been injured in a workplace accident, and what made Damon stop for a long time over that line was the detail that the man hadn't been treated in time, simply because his family couldn't afford the intervention that might have kept him alive. The woman who had saved Damon's life, the woman who had wrested a stranger's life back from death with her bare hands, was the very same woman who had once been forced to watch someone she loved slip away, only because they lacked an amount of money that, to Damon, meant almost nothing. He kept reading, and the fragments of her life continued to appear before him. Her elderly mother suffering from kidney failure, needing regular dialysis with costs piling higher and higher, a little daughter only 5 years old, and an old hospital debt still hanging over her head like a sword waiting to fall. He imagined that woman sitting in the coffee shop that morning, with a stack of papers in her hands, and he suddenly understood that she had come to that unfamiliar place not to enjoy herself, but to beg for a little mercy over the debt that was choking her, and that even while she herself was sinking in hardships so deep, she still hadn't hesitated when she rushed forward to save a stranger, to Damon, who had spent his whole life believing that kindness always came with a price and every act of giving hid a calculation. This woman's pure selflessness was like something beyond all his understanding. A kind of light he had forgotten still existed in the world. And as he sat there alone in the quiet room with the file in his hands, distant memories he had buried long ago suddenly came rushing back uninvited. The image of an orphaned boy growing up in cold street corners, never knowing the protection of an embrace. learning far too early that no one in this world gave anything away for nothing. He remembered Silas, the only man who had ever reached out a hand and pulled him up from the mud, the man who had taught him everything and had once been the closest thing to a father Damon had ever had. And he remembered, too, the day the very people he trusted most, the men he had once called brothers, turned their backs and betrayed him, stealing that man from his life. From that day on, Damon had locked his heart behind walls of steel. He swore he would never trust anyone again, never let himself be weak before anyone. And he had built an entire empire on that foundation of suspicion and cold loneliness. Yet now, a poor woman with nothing in her hands, a woman whom life itself had treated more cruelly than almost anyone, had unknowingly shaken something inside him that he had believed had turned to stone forever. And Damon realized that he couldn't, and didn't want to, let that woman continue drowning in pain when he had every ability to change it, even though deep in his heart, he still couldn't understand why a stranger could trouble him so much. Damon wasn't the kind of man who knew how to express gratitude in words. All his life, he had known only one language, the language of action and power, and so he quietly did the only thing he knew how to do. He ordered his people to go silently to the hospital where Ruth's debt was still hanging over her, and with a single phone call, the entire old hospital debt that had followed her late husband for 2 years was suddenly wiped clean, without a trace, without an explanation. He didn't stop there. He also arranged for Ruth's mother, Colleen, to be transferred to the finest treatment center in the city, where dialysis sessions were no longer a burden that forced Ruth to stay awake through the night counting every dollar, where the old woman was cared for by the best doctors money could bring in, and all of it was done in absolute silence, without his name attached, without any condition, as if some invisible hand from above had reached down and removed the chains from her life. But Ruth wasn't someone who could easily overlook anything unusual, and when she went to the hospital one afternoon to ask about her next payment schedule, the employee at the counter looked at her in astonishment and told her that her entire debt had been paid in full several days earlier, that she no longer owed anything at all. Ruth stood frozen in the hospital corridor, her hand tightening around the strap of her old cloth bag, and inside her head was a tangle of emotions she couldn't name. One part of her wanted to break down and cry from relief, but another part of her stirred with unease, because she understood all too well that miracles didn't simply fall out of the sky, that no one paid such a large sum for a stranger without a reason. She asked around everywhere, followed every clue, and finally, through someone she knew in the administrative department, she learned that the person behind all of this was the man she had saved in the café that day, the man whose name now sent a faint chill down her spine when she heard it spoken, Damon Crane. The first feeling that rose in Ruth's heart wasn't joy but an instinctive resistance, because she had never wanted her kindness to become something that could be traded. She had saved that man because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected anything in return, and the thought that her act of grace was now being answered with money made a vague pain tighten inside her before she could fully understand it. She decided she had to find him, had to speak clearly with him, had to return what she felt she had no right to accept. But what Ruth didn't know at all was that somewhere else in the city, inside a luxurious and shadowed office, another man was also quietly watching every unusual move Damon made. Marcus Webb, the crime lord's most trusted right hand, the man who had followed Damon for many years, and had thought he understood his boss better than anyone else, had begun to notice a strange change in Damon after the attack. The secret expenses, the private orders, and the name of a woman that kept appearing again and again. He picked up the phone, called someone in a low and calculating voice, and quietly ordered him to keep an eye on the woman named Ruth Delaney. Because in the world where Marcus lived, anything that could make a powerful man like Damon soften was also the fatal weakness that could be used against him. Ruth came all the way to Damon's place of work with a burning determination, and when the door to the vast room opened, and she stepped inside to face the man sitting behind the dark wooden desk, she didn't waver, though her heart was pounding hard inside her chest. She placed the confirmation paper showing that the debt had been erased on the desktop, and her voice rang out, trying to remain calm, yet still trembling with emotion. I came here to tell you that I can't accept these things. I didn't save you in exchange for money, and I don't need you to repay me this way. Damon looked up at her, his gaze still as composed as ever, and he answered in his low, dry voice that he was only returning what he owed her, that she had saved his life, and that this was the only way he knew to balance that debt. It was that cold statement that made something inside Ruth break open. She couldn't hold herself back anymore, and the words from the deepest part of her heart poured out like floodwater that had been held back for too long. Do you think everything in this world can be converted into money? Do you think a human life is a debt that can be paid with numbers on a piece of paper? She said, her voice choking. I once knelt and begged people to save my husband. I pleaded with them to just give him a chance, but they looked at me and saw only the money I didn't have, and they let him die right in front of me simply because I couldn't afford to pay. Her eyes were already red, but she didn't allow herself to collapse. She looked straight at Damon and continued, It's because I saw with my own eyes the day the life of the man I loved was weighed and measured in money, that I swore to myself I would never let anyone die in front of me just because they were poor. That is why I saved you, not because of who you are, not because of how much money you have, but only because you were a human being who needed to be saved. And if you repay that kindness with money, then you're turning the most sacred thing I still have left into an ordinary thing to be bought and sold. Her words cut into some place very deep inside Damon like blades, a place no one had been able to touch for a very long time, because in all his life he had never met anyone who refused his money and power in this way. No one had ever stood before him and spoken of kindness as something that couldn't be bought. He sat there in silence, and in that moment, the cold shell he had worn for so many years suddenly cracked. He spoke slowly, his voice unusually hoarse. You have to understand that my whole life, I've never known anything given without a price attached. Every hand that reached out to me wanted to take something in return, and the only person who ever gave me a place to shelter without asking for anything was taken from me long ago, so I don't know any other way to answer an act of grace except with the only thing I have. In that silent room, two people from worlds separated like the sky and the abyss. A poor woman who had lost everything yet had still kept a warm heart, and a powerful man who had everything yet had lost the ability to believe in kindness, saw for the first time the naked wound inside each other's soul. And in that heavy silence, both of them dimly felt that the fateful meeting in the café that day might not have been an accident, but the beginning of something that would change them both forever. After that conversation, something between Ruth and Damon changed, and though she still kept many reservations in her heart, she also gradually came to understand that this man wasn't as simple as the cold exterior he wore. So when he suggested visiting so he could thank her himself in a more proper way, she hesitated, then finally agreed. On a softly golden weekend afternoon, Damon Crane, the man before whom an entire underworld bowed in fearful respect, found himself standing a little awkwardly at the threshold of a small, plain apartment in a working-class neighborhood, holding a bag of cookies he hadn't known how to choose properly, so he had simply bought the kind a child might like. The door opened, and a little girl with tight brown curls and wide, clear eyes looked up at him with curiosity. It was Ellie, Ruth's 5-year-old daughter, and she showed no shyness at all before the tall, unfamiliar man. Instead, she immediately broke into a bright smile, asking whether he was her mother's friend and why he was so tall. Damon, who had never known how to talk to a child throughout all the dry and barren years of his life, suddenly found himself strangely flustered. He sat awkwardly on the small chair in the living room, and when Ellie ran over to show him her favorite doll, whose arm had broken off, sadly telling him that it had been ruined for several days, he took the tiny toy in his large hands accustomed to cold and ruthless work, then slowly and carefully fitted the doll's arm back into place, with a seriousness so grave it was almost funny. When the doll's arm was whole again, Ellie's eyes lit up, and she cried out with delight, clapping her hands before hugging the doll tightly. She looked up at him with admiration, as if he had just performed some great miracle. "You're really good," she said. "You can even fix broken things." And for reasons Damon couldn't understand, those innocent words from a child made his hardened heart sink softly by one beat. Throughout that afternoon, Ellie chattered to him about everything in the world in her sweet little voice, about the neighbor's cat that often came over to play, about the picture she had drawn at school that her teacher had praised, about her dream of growing up one day to become a good nurse who saved people just like her mother. And Damon simply sat there listening, sometimes giving a slight nod, sometimes letting out a clumsy question, while inside him spread a strange feeling he had never tasted before. In one corner of the room, Ruth brewed tea and quietly watched the scene, and she couldn't help being surprised to see that powerful, cold man capable of such gentleness before her daughter. His face had softened, the sharp chill in his eyes had faded, and at the corner of his mouth there was the faint trace of a smile that perhaps even he didn't realize he was wearing. In that small room filled with the sound of a child's laughter and the warmth of tea, Damon Crane, the man who had spent his entire life inside grand but empty mansions, felt for the first time the simple warmth of a true home, the very thing he had lost when he was still a lonely orphaned boy. And he suddenly understood that all the money and power he had gathered over a lifetime couldn't buy this quiet, ordinary moment, the moment when a child looked up at him with clear and trusting eyes, and a woman smiled at him from across the room. While those rare, warm moments were slowly beginning to thaw Damon's frozen heart, behind the curtain of his power, a shadow was quietly tightening its snare. Damon wasn't a foolish man, and over the past several weeks, an uneasy instinct had been rising inside him like a low fever that wouldn't break, because he understood very clearly that the attack at the café that day couldn't have been merely the reckless act of outsiders. The men who had dared strike in a crowded place, in defiance of every unspoken rule, must have known his movements with precision down to the minute, and that could only have happened if someone very close to him had sold him out. The thought sent a chill down his spine, because in a life built on suspicion, what he feared most wasn't the enemy outside the gates, but the knife thrust from within his own ranks, just as Silas had fallen years ago at the hands of the very men he had trusted most. Damon began quietly narrowing the circle around him. He reduced the number of people who knew his schedule, personally checked every link in his empire, and an oppressive air of suspicion settled over the people beneath him. Everyone could feel that their boss was hunting a shadow, and no one could be certain whether that cold gaze would stop on them. And yet the man he was hunting was the one standing closest to him, the one he suspected least. Marcus Webb had followed Damon for many long years, climbing to the position of right hand through a loyalty that had seemed impossible to shake. But beneath that devoted appearance was an ambition that had been smoldering and growing with the years, a hunger to sit for himself in the chair beside which he had only ever been allowed to stand in service. And now, when Marcus realized that his cold and untouchable boss had suddenly acquired a soft-hearted weakness named Ruth Delaney, he understood that he had found the key he needed. He had people quietly follow Ruth's every step, recording every time Damon visited her small apartment, every moment he revealed the human part of himself he had always kept hidden before, and each piece of information that came back made Marcus's eyes gleam with cold calculation. He sat in the darkness of his private room, turning a glass of liquor in his hand, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, as he thought that the iron-willed man had finally made the fatal mistake that every powerful man eventually made, letting his heart begin to feel. Because in the brutal world where they both lived, a heart capable of love wasn't a gift. It was a crack, a vulnerable point that an enemy could aim for at any time. Damon still didn't know that the shadow he was searching for was so close, right beside him, close enough to hear each breath he took. And while he poured his strength into finding the traitor hidden somewhere in the dark, the true danger had already begun silently spinning its web, not around him, but around the woman and the small home he had only just begun learning how to cherish. That fateful night descended just as Ruth had finished a long shift and was on her way home. The old phone in her pocket suddenly rang with an urgent cry that tore through the stillness of the night, and the moment she pressed it to her ear, her whole world seemed to tilt. Because on the other end was the panicked voice of caretaker, telling her that her mother had suddenly worsened, that she had fainted and been taken into the emergency room in critical condition. Ruth didn't remember how she ran through hospital corridors so familiar to her, corridors that now suddenly seemed endless. She only knew that by the time she reached the emergency room doors, her legs had given way, and the doctor who stepped out with a grave expression told her things that she, as a nurse, understood word for word, and for that very reason, suffered word for word. Colleen's condition had deteriorated faster than anything they had predicted. Her organs were gradually failing, and now she needed a complex emergency intervention a procedure that only a few leading specialists could perform. Without it, the time she had left would be counted only in days. Ruth stood there, leaning against the cold wall of the hospital corridor, and for the first time after so many years of forcing herself to endure, she felt her strength drain away completely. She was far too used to being the strong one, the one everyone leaned on, the pair of hands that held life in place for strangers. But now, when the mother who had given birth to her and raised her was lying barely alive behind that door, Ruth saw just how powerless she truly was. She thought of Ellie sleeping peacefully at home, her little girl not yet knowing that the grandmother she loved was fighting death. And she thought of the mother who had sacrificed her whole life for her, the woman Ruth had never had enough means to repay fully. Tears rolled down Ruth's exhausted face. Not the loud tears of someone crying out, but the silent tears of a woman so depleted she no longer had the strength to weep aloud. She slowly slid down to the floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and in that moment of absolute loneliness, she felt as though the entire sky were collapsing and crushing her beneath it, as she realized that no matter how hard she fought, she could not perform the complex surgery herself, and she was entirely at the mercy of a ticking clock. The cruel contradiction of her life appeared before her, once again with heartbreaking clarity. She was someone who spent her days and nights fighting to save the lives of absolute strangers, yet now, when the person who meant the world to her stood on the precipice of death, she was forced to stand on the outside, utterly powerless against a merciless fate. In the darkness of the hospital corridor near dawn, amid the smell of antiseptic and the hurried footsteps of the night shift, that woman sat curled up alone, small and desperate, carrying a grief she didn't know how to share with anyone, not daring to call the one person who could help her because her pride was still holding her back, and unaware that somewhere else in the city, a man had been silently watching over her, was about to hear of this tragedy, and was about to face a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but also the fate of the woman he was slowly becoming unable to leave behind. Colleen's intervention was finally carried out, and once again, like an invisible hand that always appeared at the right moment, every enormous cost had been quietly taken care of by someone. And Ruth didn't need to ask to know who it was. But this time, instead of simple gratitude or resistance born from pride, an entirely new fear began to creep into her mind. From the very moment she knelt down to save him in the café that day, Ruth had vaguely understood that this man was no ordinary person. But she had tried not to think about it. She had told herself that who he was mattered less than the fact that he was a human being who needed saving. Yet now, when everything had settled, the scattered pieces began to reveal themselves with chilling clarity. The way the entire room had bowed before him, the armed men who had dared strike in broad daylight, the vast sums of money spent with nothing more than a flick of his hand, and the name Damon Crane, a name that made people look at her with a mixture of caution and fear whenever she quietly asked about it, before quickly changing the subject. Ruth finally understood just how powerful a man she had drifted into the orbit of, a crime lord reigning over a dangerous and violent underworld, a world where even the slightest connection was enough to put the lives of her whole family at risk. And it was that thought that made the mother's heart inside her turn cold, because she was no longer alone. She had little Ellie. She had a mother who had just escaped death's blade. She had no right to selfishly place the weakest people she loved most in a danger she couldn't predict. After many sleepless nights of torment and struggle, Ruth made a painful decision, but one she believed was right. She would step away. She would cut off all contact with Damon to protect her small home. She sent him a short message, thanking him for everything, but asking him to let her life return to the quietness it had once known, asking him not to come to her anymore, because she had people she needed to protect. When Damon read those lines, something in his chest twisted softly, a vague pain he had thought he had long ago lost the ability to feel. But the man who had spent his whole life growing, used to betrayal and abandonment, only closed his eyes, and he didn't chase after her, didn't hold her back, didn't send even a single word in return. He was so used to being left behind that he believed this was only one more time, that he had never been worthy of the warm light she had brought into his life, and he quietly put back on the familiar icy shell, returning to his lonely empire. But there was one thing even Damon himself couldn't deny. Though he didn't go to see her, though he respected her decision to leave, he still couldn't truly let go. He continued to have people watch over her from afar, quietly making sure that she and her family were always safe, like an unseen guard standing in the darkness. And that fragile thread of connection he couldn't bring himself to sever, that gaze still turned day and night toward the woman he had already come to care for, unknowingly became the very fatal clue that the lurking traitor had been waiting for all along. It was that invisible thread Damon couldn't bring himself to cut that led the predator straight to her. Marcus Webb, the man who had patiently watched his boss's every move for so many long months, finally had what he needed, because the men Damon had sent to quietly protect Ruth from a distance, no matter how discreet they were, couldn't escape the owl-like eyes of someone who had spent his entire life in the business of stalking and betrayal. Marcus followed those very guards, and like a spider tracing its own strand of silk, he found his way to the home of the woman into whom his boss had already placed a part of his heart. Now every piece had come together completely in his mind, and a dark truth stood exposed. Marcus himself, not some force from outside, had been the one behind the entire bloody attack at the café that day. He had been the one who sold Damon's schedule to the assassins. He had been the one who recklessly shattered every unspoken rule in the hope of removing his boss and taking the throne for himself. But that day's scheme had failed, and that failure, bitterly enough, had happened because of the very woman he was now about to turn into a pawn. Marcus understood that facing Damon directly was something he still wasn't strong enough to do. The crime lord remained too powerful, too watchful, but Marcus had also discovered that the man of iron now had a fatal weakness, a crack in the armor that had once seemed impossible to pierce, and that weakness was named Ruth Delaney. In the darkness of his office, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes flashing with the poisonous gleam of a man who believed he already held victory in his hands, and he began laying out his plan. He would use that woman as bait. He would take control of her and force Damon to step into a trap from which, this time, there would be no escape. He would use the very feeling his boss had only just learned to understand to drive him into a corner. He ordered his men to tighten the circle around Ruth, cut off Damon's protectors, and prepare for the day he would strike. As for Ruth, the woman had no idea at all that simply because she had saved a human life, simply because she had allowed her kindness to touch the life of a powerful man, she had now unknowingly become the target of a cruel and vicious plot. But even in her ignorance, the instinct of a mother inside her still warned her that something strange was happening. She felt as if unfamiliar eyes were watching her on the way home. She caught glimpses of shadowy figures at street corners, where there had never been anyone before, and a vague unease began tightening around her heart. The only thing she thought about, the only thing that made her afraid until her heart twisted with pain, wasn't her own safety, but the peace of the small home she had sacrificed everything to protect. So she held her loved ones even closer, longed even more fiercely to keep them far from every danger, without knowing that she herself was standing at the very center of the storm, and that the man she had tried to push away in order to protect her family was now about to become the only one who could shield her from the tempest soon to come. Thanks to the network of eyes and ears still silently watching Ruth from afar, Damon was the first to discover the unusual movements tightening around her, and when he traced the thread connecting those strange men back to the very place he had least expected, back to his own trusted right hand, a coldness ran down his spine, because at last the shadow of betrayal he had been hunting for so long had taken shape, and it was the man standing closest to him, Marcus Webb. But what made Damon's heart tighten wasn't the betrayal itself, but the fact that Marcus had aimed at Ruth, had turned the innocent woman Damon cherished into prey in his game, and in that very moment, the man who had spent his whole life acting only for power and for the survival of his empire, made an entirely different choice for the first time. He would do everything, even trade away everything he had built, to protect the people she loved. The first thing he did wasn't prepare for war with Marcus, but make sure that the most vulnerable people, the ones Ruth would sacrifice everything to shelter, were taken to absolute safety before any storm could touch them. He personally arranged it with secrecy and care, having the most loyal and trustworthy people he had left quietly escort Colleen, who was still recovering, and little Ellie out of the city to a peaceful retreat nestled among cool green hills, a distant place guarded so carefully that no shadow of the underworld could ever find its way there. To little Ellie, all of this was nothing less than an exciting adventure. She got to sit in a smooth, comfortable car gliding past wide-open fields, got to look at cows grazing in the grass, and high mountains appearing and fading in the morning mist. And when they arrived, she cried out happily at the sight of the pretty wooden house, with a yard full of flowers and its wings swaying in the wind. They told her that this was a special vacation, a kind friend of her mother's had prepared just for her and her grandmother, and Ellie innocently believed it. She held her grandmother's hand and ran around the garden, her laughter ringing brightly in the sunlight, completely unaware of anything happening out there, wrapped entirely in a peaceful and joyful world, exactly as any child deserved to be. Only after Damon had seen for himself that the old woman and the child were absolutely safe, that no danger could touch their peace, did some part of the weight in his heart ease, and only then did he begin turning toward the next move. He understood his opponent well. He knew Marcus was waiting for him to act in blind anger, laying a trap for him to rush into in order to save Ruth, and so he couldn't let emotion lead him. With the coldness and strategy forged through a whole lifetime standing at the peak of power, Damon began silently setting a trap of his own, a trap more subtle, more patient, designed to turn the traitor's own scheme into the grave that would bury him. And this time, he wasn't fighting to protect his throne or his fortune. For the first time in his life, he was stepping into battle for a person, for the woman who had taught him that there were things in this world more precious than power. Marcus had chosen the abandoned old docks as the place to strike, a maze of rusting warehouses and towering stacks of containers swallowed in darkness, and he had lured Ruth there with a forged message, making her believe that someone she loved was in danger. The moment Ruth set foot in that place and realized she had fallen into a trap, the treacherous man stepped out of the shadows with a cold smile, smug in the belief that he held the decisive card firmly in his hand. He believed Damon would rush there in desperation to save this woman, and then walk straight into the net himself. But what Marcus never expected was that Damon had already moved one long step ahead of him. While Marcus was still lost in the pleasure of believing he had won, the true crime lord had already been silently dismantling every link in his plan. The men Marcus thought were absolutely loyal had, in truth, already been bought off or brought under Damon's control. The escape routes Marcus believed he had arranged with careful strategy had, in truth, all fallen within Damon's reach. When Damon stepped into the darkened docks, he didn't carry the look of a panicked man rushing to rescue someone. He walked slowly, calmly, with the presence of a king entering his own territory, and it was that chilling composure that made the self-satisfied smile on Marcus's face slowly freeze. Damon didn't need to swing his fists or plunge into some common brawl, because true power had never lived in a clenched hand. He only gave a slight signal, and from the darkness his loyal people appeared, silently closing off every exit, stripping away every bit of support Marcus had once trusted, leaving him standing alone inside the very trap he had set, now collapsed over his own head. "I gave you everything," Damon said, his voice low and cold, yet echoing through the silent space. "I lifted you up from nothing, and you repaid me by betraying me. That I might have forgiven. But you made a mistake I will never forgive. You dared touch an innocent person." In that moment of unbearable tension, when every eye was fixed on the confrontation between the two men, chaos suddenly broke out, and in the struggle, one of Marcus's men fell badly wounded, left lying on the cold concrete while the others cared only about running for their own lives. And then, right in the center of that storm, the instinct rooted deep in Ruth's blood and flesh rose once more, stronger than fear itself. She didn't see the man lying there as someone who only moments earlier had been part of the plot to harm her. She saw only a life that needed saving, and so that woman rushed forward, dropped to her knees beside him, and placed her hands over the wound to stop the bleeding, doing exactly what her heart told her she had to do, no matter who the person on the ground might be. Damon witnessed that scene, and in his usually cold eyes, an emotion rose that was almost impossible to name, because even in the middle of danger, even before an enemy, this woman still had not lost the sacred quality that made her different from every person in the cruel world where he lived. And he understood even more deeply just how precious the light inside her truly was, a light that he, with all his power and all his wealth, had never been able to touch in his entire life, until the day she stepped into it. But when Marcus realized that his game had completely collapsed and there was no way back, He turned into an animal driven into a corner, and in that mad desperation, he threw out one final reckless act, aiming straight at Ruth as she bent over to save a life. Everything happened in a split second, so quickly that no one had time to react. Only Ruth lifted her head and felt the danger rushing toward her in time. She managed to turn her body to shield the wounded man lying beneath her hands, and a sharp, piercing pain tore through her arm, making her buckle as a red stain slowly spread across the fabric of her sleeve. But Damon was there. The very instant he saw Ruth in danger, that man rushed forward with a speed even he hadn't expected of himself. He didn't think of his own safety. He didn't weigh gain and loss the way he had done all his life. He simply rushed to her and gathered her fully into his arms, using his own broad back as a shield to protect her from every remaining danger, exactly as she had once used her fragile body to shield him on that fateful day in the café. When his loyal men finally subdued Marcus and the docks gradually fell quiet again, Damon hurriedly let her go just enough to look at the wound on her arm, and for the first time in his life, the hands that had never trembled before anything were now shaking with fear. He clumsily pulled off his coat and pressed it desperately against her arm to stop the bleeding, his movements awkward, the movements of a man who had never known how to save anyone before. And in that confusion, when he suddenly caught sight of her eyes half closing from pain, the words she had once whispered to him in a moment between life and death spilled from his mouth by instinct. "Look at me," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Look into my eyes. Don't close yours. Breathe with me." Ruth opened her eyes slightly and looked up, and though she was sinking in pain, the corner of her mouth still lifted into a faint smile when she realized that her own words were now being returned to her by that man. She breathed out weakly that the wound wasn't that serious, that she would be all right, but Damon didn't loosen his hold. He still held tightly to her, as if afraid that if he let go for even 1 second, he would lose her forever. The man who made an entire underworld tremble, the man who was used to giving orders over the life and death of so many people, was now kneeling on the cold concrete, holding a poor woman tightly in his arms and begging her to stay, to keep breathing, not to leave him, with all the weakness and sincerity he had never revealed to anyone throughout his lonely life. In that moment, every layer of power and coldness he had worn melted away, leaving only a bare human being terrified to his very core by the thought of losing the only light that had ever warmed his frozen heart. And Ruth, lying in those arms, listening to the frantic, panicked pounding of the heart of a man who had seemed impossible to shake, suddenly understood that the circle of fate had closed completely, that the man she had saved back then was now the one saving her, and that sometimes the truest feeling in this world is born between the very people who seem as though they could never belong to each other. Two wounded souls who had found one another in the middle of a storm-battered life, and together begun to heal the wounds each had carried through so many long, endless years. After that fateful night at the docks, everything slowly came to a close in the way justice should have unfolded. Marcus Webb paid the price for his betrayal and his crimes, handed over to the law, along with all the evidence Damon had quietly gathered, so that from then on, he would never again have the power to sow danger into anyone's life. But the greatest miracle didn't lie in the fall of the villain. It lay in the transformation of a man who had seemed to have lost his soul long ago, because from the day he learned what it meant to protect another person, without expecting anything in return, Damon Crane began, step by step, to move away from the world of darkness that had raised him and imprisoned him for so many years. He slowly let go of the things that belonged to his cruel past, and began searching for a new road, a road that, for the first time in his life, he felt was worth walking. Ruth's mother, Colleen, gradually recovered and returned to the arms of her daughter and granddaughter. The debt that had once weighed so heavily on Ruth's thin shoulders disappeared, and little Ellie was once again able to laugh brightly inside a home no longer forced to fight through long nights of worry. And yet the greatest gift life finally gave back to Ruth wasn't money or comfort, but the fact that her dignity, the dignity she had held on to with such quiet strength even in the moments when she was most despised and trampled on, was finally seen and cherished exactly as it deserved to be. Two people who had carried wounds that seemed as though they would never heal, one who had lost everything yet had kept her warm heart whole, and one who had everything yet was hollow and alone, found each other and quietly healed each other, not through some fairy tale miracle, but through the sincerity and kindness each of them gave. And their story leaves us with something worth reflecting on, that the true value of a person has never been measured by the clothes they wear or the numbers in their bank account, but by what they are willing to do for someone else in the most urgent moment of need. Sometimes, the person looked down upon the most, the person standing in the lowest place, is the very one carrying the light that can save everything. Please don't ever judge a person only by their appearance, because you'll never know just how vast and noble the heart hidden beneath that faded coat may be. If today's story has touched some corner of your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can spread kindness to even more people, and so that each day we can listen together to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about this story? Was there a moment that made your heart tremble? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear the honest emotions from deep within your heart. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling each day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.